move to Mr. Matthew Gianni. Mr. Gianni is based in the Netherlands. He is an independent consultant, advisor, and advocate for marine conservation. He is a co-founder of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition and currently serves as its political and policy advisor. Mr. Gianni has been involved in international fisheries and marine conservation policy, law and treaty negotiations for almost 30 years, and he has authored and co-authored a number of papers and reports on fisheries, marine biodiversity, seabed mining, and oceans government. So now to give us a bit of that policy perspective of deep sea mining and how we are going to really develop this future industry, Mr. Matthew Gianni. And again, if you had any questions for Dr. Amon, please feel free to hold until the end of the time. Mr. Gianni, unmute. You have to unmute.
There we go. Okay, thank you, Tyrell, and very much appreciate the opportunity to participate in this webinar, and thank all of those who have logged on for attending. Just briefly, these are the logos of a number of the organizations that are involved in the deep sea part of the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition, which I co-founded, and they include environmental organizations, but also law and policy institutes, associations of parliamentarians, etc. I'm going to do just a brief kind of primer on the ISA, its structure, and some of the key provisions related to managing deep seabed mining and conserving the deep oceans. The international regime for mining the international seabed area is found in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in Part 11, and it declares that that seabed area in the international portions of the oceans is the common heritage of humankind, and that activities in the area shall be carried out for the benefit of humankind as a whole. In addition, the Law of the Sea Convention, its seabed mining provisions, require the protection of the marine environment, and that necessary measures shall be taken to ensure effective protection for the marine environment from harmful effects arising out of seabed mining activities, and that there is an obligation to ensure the prevention of damage to the flora and fauna of the marine environment in any sort of activities that the ISA, the International Seabed Authority, and I'll use the acronym ISA, permits. And again, the Seabed Authority is obligated to act on behalf of and for the benefit of humankind as a whole. So basically, the basic structure, and many of you may know this, but just to go over this, it's headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica. The Assembly of the ISA, which is the overall body, consists of 167 countries in the European Union. They have all ratified the Law of the Sea Convention and therefore are members of the International Seabed Authority and responsible for its functioning. The Council of the ISA is 36 countries. It's a subset of the 167, grouped into 5 regional or political groups, including the group of Latin American and Caribbean states as a block of countries. Further, there's the Legal and Technical Commission of the ISA, which is 41 individuals that are elected to serve as advisors in their individual capacity, but they hold enormous power, as we'll see later. The Secretariat of the ISA, which kind of administers the ISA, but also has a lot of influence over what happens and the direction that the organization takes, and the Finance Committee. And at some point to be created, the Economic and Planning Commission, the Inspectorate, and the Enterprise, if and when exploitation begins. So as Dr. Amon said, there is no exploitation yet, no mining actually permitted in the International Seabed Authority, but there are 30 the regulations that would allow exploitation are currently under negotiation and have been negotiations since about 2015 or so. And they deal with the relationship between the companies or the state enterprises that have the mining contracts and would get the mining contracts in the Seabed Authority itself. Environmental regulations are also part of these negotiations. A key element of these negotiations is the financing and royalty regime. Any country or company that mines has to pay into a fund administered by the International Seabed Authority for distribution to all other countries, to all the member countries of the Seabed Authority. It's a share the wealth obligation, and they are negotiating currently how much companies or countries would have to pay in order to get mining licenses. Setting up the mining inspectorates and other things. And it's important to remember that the Law of the Sea Convention was negotiated in the 1970s, technically from 1973 to 1982, and amended in the early 1990s. And a key element of the agreement, and we'll see some others, is that no country or company can mine the International Seabed Authority without the approval from the ISA, that is to say, the countries that are members of the ISA. And this was really critically important at the time, because, and still is, to ensure that there's not a free-for-all. That the developed countries, for example, don't go out there and start mining under whatever regulations they decide to impose upon themselves. Or to do mining without the consent of the international community as a whole. I won't go into this other than to show that there are lots of complications in terms of when you get down into the details of what the exploitation regulation should contain. And this is just a select group of things. There are more issues that are elements of these negotiations. The current draft text of these negotiations runs to over 100 pages, I believe, although that does include a number of proposals for amendments and so forth to the draft. But just to follow from what Dr. Amon said, this is a paper that basically, in essence, says the similar thing to what the scientist's statement that Dr. Amon referred to. Biodiversity loss from deep seabed mining is unavoidable, irreversible on human timescales, and biodiversity offsets in the deep sea are scientifically meaningless. And part of the concern that Dr. Amon mentioned is the sheer size of these mining operations. So most of the commercial interest currently resides or lies in mining the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. It's an area of the Eastern Pacific, roughly this size. And by comparison with the North American continent, you can see it's quite a very large area. It's about 4.5 million square kilometers. And 17 of the 30 exploration contracts that have been issued by the ISA to date are for polymetallic nodules here in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. And most of what is currently under negotiating in the ISA at the moment is to open up this particular area to mining. So the mining for the so-called nodules. And just to give you a visual sense of the size of these mining operations that Dr. Amon mentioned, a single CC mining operation over the course of a 30-year mining contract would essentially strip mine about 10 to 12,000 square kilometers of seabed, and that's sort of representative. And I apologize for the crudeness of this diagram. These areas in black, and these are the Benelux countries. They're about 75,000 square kilometers. And that's the size of each of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone mining claims. So each country gets 75,000 square kilometers to mine. Over 30 years, they would mine about 10 to 12,000 kilometers in patches throughout the area, and they would create plumes that would extend anywhere from 1 to 3 times beyond the sites. And those are conservative estimates from the scientists. Some say these plume flows would cover the entire site, that would impact the respiratory and digestive organs of the animals that live in the area. And again, as Dr. Amon mentioned, the deep sea is important for the ecosystem services it provides, as well as it constitutes one of the largest reservoirs of biodiversity on the planet Earth, and is already under stretch from a variety of impacts. So in addition to the environmental concerns, there are structural and political concerns regarding the ISA. There is a lack of transparency. The Legal and Technical Commission meets behind closed doors. All of the contracts that are issued by the International Seabed Authority to the companies or countries that hold the exploration licenses at the moment are confidential. And the ISA, secondly, the ISA has an inherent conflict of interest. It will be both the regulator, but also the beneficiary of royalty payments that come in from issuing mining licenses. There's a sort of a bureaucratic and institutional momentum to mine. There are use or lose it incentives hardwired into the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention. At some point, countries may feel compelled to mine because they would risk losing their exploration contracts. And currently, at least 25 of the 30 exploration contracts are in the hands of only 7 countries and 3 companies. The 7 countries being China, France, Germany, India, Japan, Korea, and Russia. And 3 companies, UK Seabed Resources, which is sponsored by the UK government, Global Sea Mineral Resources, which Dr. Amen mentioned, a company based in Belgium, and the Metals Company, a company based in Canada, sponsored by Nauru, Kiribati, and Tonga. Other concerns, all countries have equal opportunity to mine and or becoming a sponsoring state. And this was something that was considered very progressive at the time, particularly the provisions that make it, that facilitate developing countries to be able to go mining, in response to the concern that only the developed countries with the financial wherewithal and the technological capacity could do so, or would be the first to do so. But what that now means is that any country that applies for a mining license is likely to get it. The ISA is in a politically and legally difficult situation or position to deny any country that applies for a mining license. And finally, and this is one of the concerns of a lot of countries, as well as the NGOs and others, that there is an arguably undemocratic decision-making structure weighted toward mining. If the Legal and Technical Commission recommends that a application for a mining license be approved, as few as 2 to 13 countries that are members of the International Seabed Authority can guarantee that that company or that country gets a license, even if all of the other countries are opposed to that company or that country or any license being given. And this is, I won't go into the details, but it's a very bizarre, arcane decision-making structure that is a product of Cold War politics in the 1970s, and then hyperpower politics in the early 1990s when that decision-making structure was amended. In terms of the benefit to humankind as a whole, the estimates based on the value of the nodules in terms of their final, the metals that would be refined from the nodule mining, of the payout to ISA member countries have been done by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for the ISA, and they concluded basically it would amount to a few $100,000 per year. So a number of countries in the 1970s felt that the world would get rich off licensing mining in the common area of the ocean, the International Seabed Authority area. But as it turns out, given the economics of metals prices today and the cost of the mining and the type of royalty regime that is under negotiation, it looks like the benefit could be a few $100,000 or less if divided up equally amongst the 167 countries per mining license per year. But it could be profitable for individual companies and possibly some sponsoring states, though not all states can or would share equally in the benefits as sponsoring states, because that would mean that the ISA would have to open up at least 167 mines for each and every country that would be a sponsoring state. And that's simply, aside from the ecological impossibility of that, it's simply not possible politically or in terms of the way licensing occurs at the ISA. But one of the big concerns is that the economics is likely to drive the industry. So as I mentioned before, the ISA is constitutionally in a difficult position to deny any country a license if it applies for a mining license. And if it proves profitable and the first licenses are issued, then many countries or companies may want to join in a gold rush. And the ISA must give all countries an equal opportunity to mine. So is it necessary to go mining with all of this, bearing in mind this? Well, most of the argument in support of deep seabed mining for the nodules in particular is we need these metals to build batteries to transition to our transportation sectors to renewable energy technologies. And that's simply not true. That's an assertion, not a fact. And in fact, there is the technology is for building batteries is rapidly changing. And this slide basically indicates that there are a variety of different chemistries for building batteries. But to mention here that the two top electric vehicle manufacturing companies in the world, BYD from China and Tesla, are the majority of cars that they sell are made with lithium iron phosphate batteries. There's no nickel, there's no cobalt, and there's no need for the metals to mine nodules to obtain these metals to build electric vehicles. And looking more broadly, a study in 2016, which is echoed by subsequent studies, indicate that it's not necessary to mine the deep sea to meet metals demands to transition to a 100% renewable economy under the most ambitious scenarios, i.e. 100% renewable economies by 2015. In addition, there are political concerns coming from laterally from other sectors. So as many of you may know, the new implementing agreement of the Law of the Sea Convention for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond their national jurisdiction was just adopted last month in New York after a 20-year process of consultations, discussions, and negotiations over the last 5 years or so. And this, raises a kind of a tale of two instruments, using the kind of riffing off of the Charles Dickens novel. On the one hand, states through the UN General Assembly negotiations have negotiated a new instrument, an implementing agreement of the Law of the Sea Convention for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. On the other hand, states the ISA are negotiating a new instrument under the Law of the Sea Convention, in this case, the mining code for areas beyond national jurisdiction, that is likely to lead to biodiversity loss in ecosystems already under stress. So how do you reconcile these two competing objectives that the nations of the world, largely the same nations of the world, are in the process of negotiating? And we have additional political commitments made by states at a very high level over the years since the negotiation of the Law of the Sea Convention and the amendments that were adopted in 1994. And in particular, SDG 14, the Ocean Sustainable Development Goal, and Target 14.2. By 2020, states have committed to sustainably manage and protect marine and coastal ecosystems to avoid significant adverse impacts, including strengthening their resilience and take action for their restoration. And the conclusion from scientists in the presentation that Dr. Amon has made is that if it's allowed to proceed now, particularly in the absence of adequate scientific information, it's likely to cause significant adverse impacts on marine ecosystems, weaken their resilience, and cause damage from which they may never recover. So fundamentally at odds with this political commitment that was made through the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we come to the current situation. The state of Nauru, which sponsors the metal company, the Canadian company, which is aggressively arguing for and pushing for to open the deep ocean to nodule mining so that it can begin doing the nodule mining and for the purposes of selling into the battery market, but also to sell into the to the U.S. military and other defense contractors. I mean, they've made this clear. This is where they want to sell the metals that they will get from the nodules under permit from the ISA. And the 2-year rule set a deadline of July 2023, and this is a rule established in the 1994 amendments to the Law of the Sea Convention, which is to say, part of the UNCLOS architecture, legal architecture, that the ISA Council should either adopt exploitation regulations, in which case Nauru can apply for an exploitation license on behalf of the metals company, or if it doesn't adopt the regulations by 9 July 2023, then the Council must consider and approve provisionally an application for a mining license. This is the language in the Law of the Sea Convention. The Council will not adopt regulations by 9th of July because it doesn't meet again until 10 July. And even that meeting, which will go from 10 to 24 July of this year, very few, if any, of the members of the Council of the ISA, the 36 members, expect that regulations will be adopted either in July or even later this year or even next year. But paragraphs, these obligations come from paragraph 15 of section 1 of the annex. So the big debate last month when the Council of the ISA most recently met was, what do they do under this point B here in the Law of the Sea Convention, the amendments, that if Nauru applies for a license, or anybody else, but in particular Nauru, on behalf of the metals company. And the Council decided that, in fact, the Council does not have to provisionally approve a license to mine after a mining license. Sorry about that. After July 9 July 2023 until the regulations are adopted. And this was a major step forward for kind of coming to grips with these provisions that were negotiated in the 1970s, again in the 1990s. And this is a live debate, and the Council will continue to debate this issue. What procedure will it use to decide whether or not to issue a license if Nauru applies for a license at some point this year or early next. The metals company, the company that Nauru sponsors, has said they intend to apply for a license before the end of 2023. So it's almost a kind of a watch this space. But the reality is most members of the council and others in the ISA are saying no licenses should be granted until the rules have been the exploitation regulations have been adopted. And most agree that may take several more years at least before there is an agreement on all of the key provisions that need to be agreed upon. So, and in the meantime, there's growing support for a moratorium because of the scientific concerns, because of the concerns over the structure and the bylaws of the ISA. 14 countries, including Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, and Panama, along with Chile, France, Germany, Spain, Ecuador, Palau, Fiji, and a number of other Pacific Island nations are now calling for a moratorium at the International Seabed Authority. The European Parliament has done the same. As Dr. Amon mentioned, over 700 marine science and policy experts for 444 countries have signed on to a precautionary pause statement. A number of key companies, including companies that would be the downstream users of the minerals or the metals that would be mined in the deep sea, have come out and supported a moratorium. These include the BMW Group, Volvo Group, Samsung XDI, one of the biggest battery manufacturers in the world, Philips, Google, etc., and so forth. And so to conclude, and I hope I'm within more or less in the time frame, key governance decisions need to be made in the next few years about the direction that countries will decide to take the International Seabed Authority and the agreement that was reached in the 1970s in light of what we know today. So key elements of those decisions are that a much better understanding of deep sea species and ecosystems is required before informed decisions can be made about whether mining can go forward, and if so, how it can be managed to prevent damage to the marine environment. They need to establish an approach that's consistent with international commitments that have been reached or developed since then, and legal agreements, the Sustainable Development Goals, the so-called BB&J agreement adopted in March of last year. The need for reform or transformation of the ISA, which is something that we're arguing for, and a number of others, a number of countries are now picking up on. Transparency of the Legal and Technical Commission, having another look at the ISA decision-making process to better reflect the legal obligation to act on behalf of humankind as a whole, and not a handful of companies or countries that may want to mine. There needs to be a societal transformation to resource-efficient, closed-loop materials and circular economies and responsible terrestrial mining practices before the world decides to go into deep-sea bed mining. And finally, there's a need for a social license to mine, including the consent of coastal communities and indigenous peoples for the benefit of humankind as a whole. And this was something that was agreed in the meeting of the Biodiversity Summit that took place in Montreal in December of last year, the 15th Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. So a few elements of a few places where deep sea bed mining has been in the news. I meant to fill out this slide